This is Science Friday. I'm Ira Plato. Last year, during the NCAA March Madness tournament, photos and videos from inside the athletes' weight rooms went viral. The images showed the difference between what was available to the men's and women's teams. The men's weight room was chock full of fitness training devices. For the female athletes, the only weights were 6 pairs of dumbbells. People were understandably mad. Women were insulted. The NCAA leadership apologized, and the women's weight room was upgraded. This was one of many examples of a harmful stereotype, a misconception about women in sports that has been around for, well, as long as I can remember. Strength training is for men, not for women. That kind of thinking is not only wrong, but can have serious consequences. As research shows, female athletes are more prone to certain injuries, and a lot of strength training and a lack of strength training is a big reason why. Joining me to talk about this topic are two researchers who study gender differences in sports training. Joanne Parsons, a physical therapist and associate professor at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, and Stephanie Cohen, health geographer and associate professor at the University of Nottingham in England. Welcome, both of you, to Science Friday.
Thank you so much for having us, Ira.
Nice to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes. Joanne, let's start with you. I know you both work together on research about ACL injuries in women and girls. Let's talk about what is an ACL and why are ACL injuries? What are they?
Sure. So ACL stands for anterior cruciate ligament. So it's one of the main stabilizing ligaments in our knees, and it prevents kind of rotational movement in our knee. And we chose to study ACL injuries, or chose them as a good example in our paper, because they're relatively common in sports from all levels, whether you're a recreational athlete up to the elite levels. And when they do happen, they are devastating. They can be life-altering for people, not just the immediate, pain and the lack of ability to participate in their sport, but people who experience this injury often have to have surgery. The rehabilitation, whether you have surgery or not, can take 9 months or more. And then you end up with increased risk of developing early onset osteoarthritis in your knee and having a joint replacement earlier in life. So very significant injury that does happen to a lot of young girls and women in particular.
Well, how big of a gender difference is there with ACL injuries?
Yeah, it does depend on the level that you're playing, whether recreational or competitive sport. It also depends on the sport. So basketball and soccer tend to be higher risk sports. The risk can be anywhere between, it's about 2 to 6 times higher injury risk in girls and women compared to boys and men. Yes, it is significant. And just to give it kind of an individual risk example, a high school girl that plays basketball or soccer for 1 season, so let's say 3 to 4 months-ish, will have a 1% chance of rupturing their ACL. So not completely insignificant there.
Mm-hmm. Stephanie, what did you find about why women are more susceptible to ACL injuries?
So what we're trying to propose in the work that we're doing is actually that we need to consider the kind of cumulative effects of gendered exposures over the life course in terms of shaping women and girls' ACL injury risk. So we know a lot about how sex-based biological factors may play into some of the sex-based and gender disparities that we see in terms of things like hormones and knee biomechanics, but that doesn't explain anything, or everything, sorry, not anything, it does explain some things. But as Joanne said, this gender disparity has persisted, and it's persisted for a long time. So part of what we're trying to do in our work is to ask new questions about why this gender disparity in ACL injury might be occurring, and that might hopefully give us some new solutions in terms of how we can address this inequity. So what we conceptualize is that we actually might consider the ways that women and girls are exposed to different gendered environments throughout our lifetimes in ways that might shape how we move and use our bodies, and ways that might make us more susceptible to these particular types of injuries. So these kinds of social exposures might then play out over time materially in our bodies, and that might be part of why we see this kind of gender disparity. And so in the work that Joanne and I and our colleague Cherie Becker are doing, we've proposed kind of 4 environments where we might think about the way that this occurs. So we talk about the pre-sport environment. So this is very early in life where we're socialized to move and use our bodies in highly gendered ways. If we think about, for example, rough outdoor play for boys and indoor play for girls. And then when we move into the context of sport, whether it's recreational or leisure sport or more competitive sport, we can think about training environments like the gym, for example. The NCAA example you mentioned is a prime example. And I think if we think that this happens at the most elite levels of sport, where there's so much resource, that's just the tip of the iceberg for what might be happening at, your recreational soccer club down the road. So we need to be looking at what's happening in those environments. And then as well, the competition spaces. So, we might think about the different ways that perhaps women might be socialized to coping with and playing through pain. And then Joanne mentioned the complexities involved in rehabilitating an ACL injury after surgery, after intervention. And so the rehabilitation environment is another place where we might think about, why do we see different outcomes between women and men? And maybe we need to think about the sort of gendered context of women's lives. Women might have more caring responsibilities. And what does that mean for women's capacities to complete a full course of rehabilitation or adhere to a rehabilitation regimen? So what we're trying to do is kind of say, here are a bunch of domains that we think might be having an impact. And we want to start asking those questions. It's not that biology doesn't matter, but actually what we want to consider is, how do these social contexts over time materially play out in our bodies? Because if we can change aspects of our environments, that can have wide-reaching impacts for populations of women and girls.
Joanne, as a physical therapist, do you see a lot of misconceptions about why girls and women experience some sports injuries more than men and boys? I mean, in certain parts of their bodies, perhaps?
Yes, absolutely. And Steph kind of alluded to this. Sport injuries and ACL injuries in particular have always been approached with a very biological viewpoint. So thinking that things like your anatomy, so women have wider hips, for example, hormonal changes during the month, physiology. So the thought that women and men have different contraction rates with their muscles and different contraction patterns with their muscles. So those kinds of things are the causes of injury. So but the interesting thing is that there's been literally tens of thousands of research studies done since the 1990s, when the first studies about ACL injury and the injury rate disparity between girls and boys came out. Tens of thousands of research studies, but that injury rate disparity has not changed. And so we have to be missing something. There has to be more to the story than that. And that's what Steph is talking about with considering the gendered aspects of our lives and how that might affect our injury risk. And even one thing beyond that too is that not only are the current approaches not working, they've got us to a certain place for sure, but it's not working. It's not only not working, but it could introduce other risks and potential harms. For example, a couple of years ago, a paper came out that suggested that physicians recommend oral contraceptives to all girls competing in sport to reduce ACL injuries. And we don't believe that that's a realistic approach or even an ethical approach. So we need to challenge these misconceptions and ask new questions.
Just a reminder that this conversation was recorded in front of a live Zoom audience. And if you want to learn more about how you can join a future recording, go to sciencefriday.com/live stream. And we have our first question from our Zoom audience. Let's go to Lauren. Hi, Lauren. You have a question about a personal injury. Go ahead.
Hi, Ira.
Hi there.
So yeah, I tore my ACL when I was 16. So it's been probably 20 years now. It's been a while playing soccer. And I just want to preface this as I grew up in Texas. And the doctor told me that while I was very thin, I had wide baby making hips. So he wasn't surprised that I tore my ACL. And that phrase has stuck with me for 20 years. And I've always wanted to know, is there any validity to that at all?
Oh, that's a great question, because we've heard that so many times before, right, Joanne? Right, Stephanie?
Absolutely. That is one of the go-to reasons that you'll see on social media when it's written about in news articles and unfortunately from healthcare professionals. And no, there's almost no validity to that, I'm going to say. And I'm sorry you had that experience, first of all. That's not a good positive experience to have when you've just experienced this huge life-altering injury. There may be a slight contribution of anatomy to ACL injury risk, but it would be so minute that it is really not, it is not the driving force of why our young girls, and usually it's women or girls between about the ages of 13 and 17, that's the highest rate of injuries that happen in girls and women at that age. That it's such a small contribution that I'm never going to say no validity, because I'm a scientist and that can never really be proven, but I would say very, very little validity to unfortunately what your physician had told you.
Stephanie, though, your research does make a distinction between sex and gender. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, definitely. I also just wanted to jump in on that and just say that I think that is such an illustrative example of how sexism is kind of baked into our current paradigm around thinking about ACL injury, kind of blaming women's bodies as being somehow inherently risky. So that's part of what we're trying to do with this work, is to kind of counter that and offer other plausible ways and mechanisms that we need to explore that might be shaping these outcomes. So thanks for that question, Lauren. I'll circle back now to thinking about sex and gender. So this is one of those cases in science and in research where we're often constrained to operationalizing things in sometimes oversimplified ways. And this is arguably the case with sex and gender, in which sex is generally thought of as pertaining to biological characteristics, so hormones, genes, reproductive anatomy that distinguish maleness and femaleness in very binary ways sometimes. And gender is thought of as a social phenomenon that's about how we identify as men, women, gender diverse people, the roles that society ascribes to us, and how gender is institutionalized and structures society. But theories and evidence now really show us that, of course, both of these are complex and neither is actually binary. So in our work, we draw on theories from the field of social epidemiology that further challenge the binary distinction as well between sex and gender. So this challenging that binary between the biological and the social, and actually suggests that we need to understand sex and gender as entangled. So that means that we can't neatly distinguish between the biological and the social, but that we have to understand them as having interactive relationships, which may actually be difficult to tease out in practice. It's complex stuff, but this line of thinking takes as a starting point that gendered life experiences have material effects on the body. So that's where this entangling of the biological and the social comes into play. And that's what we're trying to open up with this line of thinking that we are exploring around ACL injury.
Now, I started out our interview by talking about the NCAA weight room, but this goes back a lot earlier in life, right, Stephanie? How early in life are kids exposed to gendered exercise?
I would say from the beginning. I think research shows that there are examples of kind of gendered types of play from our earliest childhoods. I'm sure we can all sort of conjure up some images of what that was like in our own experiences. So I think these things are at play right in the beginning, from the types of toys that parents buy for children. They're kind of just implicitly, it's difficult for us all to escape these kinds of gendered contexts and assumptions. We all hold these implicit kind of biases. So these things affect us from very early on, and they may affect us in ways that might offer us different kinds of opportunities for the sorts of physical capabilities and skills that we develop in our bodies. If we think about the different sort of types of activities that boys and girls are encouraged to do and participate in from an early age. I wonder, for example, how many US high schools have women's football teams? Right, so we still see these quite sort of overt differentials in the opportunities that young people have afforded to them.
I even see it a lot earlier than that. I mean, how many times do you just see girls playing jump rope, right? That's an early exercise.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So Joanna, I'm going to give you a magic wand. I know you need one. And if you could fix hypergendered exercise, what would your ideal form of non-gendered sports conditioning look like?
Oh, that's a good question, and maybe a loaded question. The first thing I'd get rid of is gendered reveal parties, but that's for another conversation, perhaps. I would say that our work is not necessarily about non-gendered conditioning. It's about creating equitable opportunities rather than equality. We're talking about equitable opportunities so that we're meeting people where they're at. We're providing each individual person with what they need, regardless of their sex, gender. But having said that, we do know that there are gendered environments in sports. So the weight room is the perfect example. You use the NCAA example, which we constantly go back to as well, because it's so high profile. And there is some research as well that shows us that the types of exercises that are prescribed by coaches during warm-ups can be different depending on whether the coach is a man or a woman and whether the athletes are women or men. So and the thing about specific to ACL injuries that's interesting is that there's been a push in the last few years to develop specific injury prevention programs for women and men, so separate programs that are different. And our feeling is that sex-specific programming may knowingly or unknowingly really embed and perpetuate these stereotypes and differences that already disadvantage girls and women. So we think that before we assume that training for ACL injury prevention needs to be different for girls and women or boys and men, we need information as to what already exists. We actually don't have a great idea about the gendered environments that exist in sport and how that may relate to injury risk for the ACL. We just don't know because that work hasn't been done. So we have a ways to go. And so I wouldn't say that we would, non-gender exercise. We need the information first to figure out what's already happening. And then where do we need to go from there?
And so, Stephanie, how do we make strength training more inviting for both women and girls?
So I think we need to, as we've kind of been touching on in this conversation, sort of move away from a focus on kind of fixing women, the example that Joanne gave about sort of oral contraceptives as an intervention, to thinking more comprehensively about how we can change our environments and intervene in the gendered relations that disadvantage women in physical activity and sport. And so I would situate strength training environments within this kind of wider context. So I think it is sort of a bigger project of change as well, as in terms of thinking about the wider gendered relations that filter into these particular environments like the gym, which manifest very quite polarized gendered relations and kind of gender type women and men into specific types of masculine or feminine coded activities. So there's work that needs to happen within training environments, strength training environments, but it is also this sort of bigger project. And I think sometimes when we think about the bigger project, it can be kind of daunting in terms of how do we actually do that. But I do think there are a few things we could do within training environments or strength training environments specifically. So one thing is, I think women's strength training begets women's strength training. So in some of the work that I've done around gym environments, women commented to me that, you know, not seeing women in particular sections of the gym, like the free weight section, signaled to them that it wasn't a space for women. It wasn't a space where women were welcome. So I think we need to insert women and gender diverse role models in those spaces. And I also think we might think creatively about ways to sort of materially reconfigure gyms in terms of challenging these kinds of gendered lines that get quite entrenched. You know, if we think about men doing weights and women doing cardio. So maybe there's scope to intersperse equipment and activities in different ways. This was something suggested by some of the research participants who participated in my work on gyms. And another element that I think is important is, you know, what's on the walls. It might seem really mundane, but every gym has posters, adverts, flyers, and they can give really powerful signals about the types of bodies and people and who is welcome in certain spaces and what they, you know, should or shouldn't be doing. And I also think that there's work that shows that, you know, a lot of strength and conditioning coaches are men. So when it comes to more competitive athletes, I think we need to think about, you know, how do we support more women in getting into those strength and conditioning leadership positions.
This is Science Friday from WNYC Studios. We're on a Zoom meeting talking with Joanne Parsons and Stephanie Cohen, who are both studying ACL injuries in women and sports training. Here's a Zoom question from someone anonymously on Zoom, and it goes like this. To me, the biggest gap is in strength training. It needs to be ingrained in physical ed from the beginning, Joanne.
I would absolutely agree. Interesting that you've said that. I've done some work with a local high school in my city that has a school weight room, and up here, and speaking from Canada, so high school weight rooms are actually not that common. So when you do have one, it's a great resource to have. This particular school that I've been working with actually hired a full-time woman strength and conditioning coach, and she was in there every day, all day, welcomed everybody in there, instructed students on how to use the equipment, because that's a huge barrier that girls and women report to going into those spaces, is they don't know how to use the equipment. They don't know what exercises they should be doing. The other thing that the strength and conditioning coach did in that gym was just temper behavior and kind of calmed down some people who tended to take over the space and dominate the space, so that others who were more timid felt more comfortable coming into the space. And the other thing that they did at that school, which my research participants reported really drove them to trying resistance training and actually keeping with it after their phys ed class was done, is that they had to complete 6 hours in the school weight room as part of their phys ed class. It was mandatory. You couldn't get out of it. You had to do it. And they hated it to begin with. Many of the girls reported they did not want to go in there and they hated it. But by the end of just those 6 hours, they realized, oh, this is something I can do. My friends seem to like doing it. Let's go in there together. And now they're going to boot camps, and they go in there on their lunch hours, and they actually are introduced to an activity that they like and they can do for their whole life. And so I absolutely agree. I think that we need to target kids and girls in particular at younger ages. That gets them just thinking this is a routine activity that I am welcome to do, and that makes me feel good and is good for my health. So I'm absolutely on board with that anonymous commenter.
And I think that's where we're going to have to stop, because we have run out of time. Some great talk here. Thank you both for taking time to be with us today. And thank you all on Zoom. Joanne Parsons, physical therapist, associate professor at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada. Stephanie Cohen, health geographer, associate professor at the University of Nottingham in the UK. Thank you both for taking time to be with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.